Okay, so my understanding is you want to talk specifically about science submissions?
That would be good.
Okay. So, just have to ask, how many of you were science majors? So a few.
Do social sciences count?
Sure.
That's like a half yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually a really good point because, often, when people say the sciences, they assume natural sciences, so things related to biology, chemistry, physics, earth science, maybe mathematics. Although math is something else altogether, I think. But in fact, there is in most of the social sciences, many of the basic methodologies and the way we approach a research problem are the same, right? The tools are different. But really, sort of often the methods that we see in certain social sciences, especially, like certain branches of psychology, sociology, economics, political science, anthropology, are the same. They're really not that different. So when you consider, when I talk about science, I think a good place to start is for us to understand, and Ashley will understand this probably perhaps better than anybody, since she's already asked me some questions. What language does science derive from? The word science.
I'm gonna guess Latin.
It is Latin. Okay. So we could take the verb or the noun. Let's take both. So let's start with the verb. I like verbs. I especially like the infinitive because they're very active, right? And I also like to split infinitives whenever I can because I was an original Trekkie to boldly go. So the Latin word is scire, S-C-I-R-E. Does anyone know what that means? I guess I'm Googling.
I checked the OED.
Yeah. Scire means to know. That's what it means. The noun, scientia, means what?
Knowledge.
Knowledge. Okay. So if you think about much of what we do in research, right? Many of us can say, oh, well, there's this quest for knowledge. We want to know. So in a sense, many of us are sort of in this realm of this broad thing called science. Over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, over the millennia, I think we kind of ruined pure words like science, right? So for instance, I was brought up when I was your age as a physics major. If you go back to Newton's time, what was physics considered science? Was there science? What was it?
Alchemy?
No, alchemy is a special branch of science. Oh, but there weren't scientists in Newton's time, really. What were they? They were philosophers. They were natural philosophers, right? So there, we also have this deeply rooted idea, right, that, we've got knowledge and we've got philosophy. What is philosophy?
Well, isn't it like
The study of knowledge?
No.
If you get a PhD, then it's like the doctor of, because it's like as a philosophical
Yeah.
thing. It's
Yes,
like,
but I'm asking you, what
Doctor
is
of knowledge.
philosophy?
HMPG 150.
Well, that's one branch of physiology, which is epistemology, which is understanding the roots or the roots of truth and knowledge. That's one branch of philosophy. So break the word apart.
Well,
The love of what?
philo is like, love, like someone who loves knowledge.
Right. Okay. And so now the other part of the word isn't actually Latin. Sorry. It's the other favorite language I have.
Greek.
Greek. So what does that word mean? So who's ever heard of Sophocles? Okay. In case you haven't realized, I don't speak like your normal natural scientist. So, and that's because one of my degrees is in classics as well as physics. So Sophocles, you ever heard of Sophocles? Anything he wrote? Nothing?
Antigon.
Huh?
Antigon. He wrote the play.
Yeah.
Or how's it pronounced?
I think it's Antigone.
Antigone.
Antigone, that's one of them. It's part of a trilogy.
The Oedipus Rex.
Oedipus Rex, and the third one, I'm just trying to impress Dr. Nolly back here. Oedipus at Columbus. Okay, that's the trilogy. So how many of you are sophomores? Okay, what does sophomore mean? I always like to tell my freshmen they're about to become miserable human beings because they're about to become sophomores. So what is a sophomore?
God, I love the Oxford English Dictionary.
Okay, literally it means a wise fool, right? And the idea is that sophomores think they get the whole thing figured out by the end of their freshman year. In fact, yeah, you don't quite yet. But so philosophy is a love of really wisdom, right? Not knowledge, right? So philosophy, science. Okay, so that's an introduction. But the point is, many of us should and can consider ourselves to be scientists. It's not just restricted to, the natural sciences, right? And again, it kind of gets lost over time, right? And then people sort of hold on to things, right? So like one of my favorite things is, this idea that people are doctors, right? So what is a doctor?
Someone with a PhD.
Well, it could be. What else is it, Ivy? So what is a doctor? Is it a profession?
It does also refer to a profession.
It can,
Yeah.
because certain people have co-opted the word. Right? Doctor is an academic title, right? It's not a profession, right? You're thinking of, well, many people call a doctor, which is
Medical.
it's a physician,
Yeah.
right? I am a natural scientist, but I happen to covet my degree because I have my highest academic degree is a philosophical degree, right? It's a doctor of philosophy, right? So that's kind of cool. I like it. I still like it. Anyway, so let's talk about really what we're probably talking about most of the time are papers that are going to be submitted that are in the natural sciences and the social sciences. So, number one thing, should be true of any submission that involves writing. What should that be? What should impress you as a reviewer, as an editor?
It's unique.
Okay, it's unique. Well, I can write lots of unique things.
It's well spoken.
So what do you mean by that, Ivy?
That they have phrased what their point is in a manner that is clear,
Mhm.
and they are relating back to it throughout the paper.
Right. It's readable, it's understandable, right? Don't be fooled by people who use lots of jargon, right? They're trying to impress you. And I don't get impressed by jargon, right? If people start throwing jargon around and acronyms around and I don't understand, how long am I going to read the article?
Not too long.
Not too long at all, right? So typically scientific papers have sections. The traditional section, so those usually in order, are the first thing is an abstract, right? So you're all familiar with abstracts. Many of you have submitted proposals or abstracts if you're in your junior or senior year for your capstone projects. What's the purpose of the abstract?
It is to encapsulate the idea of exploration.
Well, there's more than that.
It serves as not a summary, but a layout of the idea that is being discussed throughout the paper. So through it, if the reader reads it, they understand what's the goal of the paper or
Mhm.
the writer.
Yes, so it's also the goal. Is that all it has?
So you should be able to read the abstract and know pretty much what the paper is about.
That's right. I would argue the two most important parts of a scientific paper are the abstract. And if I'm looking through a journal, what's going to get me to the abstract? Right? Let's say I've got a journal that's got 50 papers in it. Yeah.
The title?
The title, right? So the title should actually encapsulate, something. One of the things I always tell my students is don't waste words, So one of my favorite editors of all time was a very famous editor for New Yorker magazine, who also, I'm sure, every one of you has read. One thing he's known, in people like Dr. Nunley's sphere as an English professor, perhaps, is he actually was one of the co-authors of probably the most famous writing style handbook. So what is that? Whose book is that?
Black and white.
Stark and White, right? Of those two names, who do you know? There is a 50-50 chance. You ever read anything by someone named Strunk? You think? You ever read anything by anyone called White? Yeah, what have you read by someone whose last name is White? Yeah, it's the same one. Charlotte's Web, Hubbard Swan, Stuart Little, that's E.B. White. And, so as children, and, I think it's just still great stories to read as an adult, but we know E.B. White for those things. But what E.B. White was really known for was an economy of words, right? He would write editorials, and he would spend an entire day to get those 500 words exactly correct, right? He would struggle with this, but he wanted to get his point across in as few words as possible, okay? It's hard to write a powerful abstract, right? And it's not so easy writing a powerful title. But just like a newspaper headline, I know I'm talking newspapers to you guys now, you probably don't read newspapers. But, the two most important parts of an article are the title, right? And that first or second sentence, right? The hooks, that's what's going to get you in there. Same thing with a scientific paper. So those are important. If you can't get beyond those two things, chances are you're going to say, this isn't worth it for Audeamus, right? So those are important. The next part is the introduction. Okay, the introduction is giving you the necessary background to set up a question that's being addressed. Okay, and usually the end of the introduction is going to lay out, it's going to maybe summarize, but it's going to lay out those basic questions and maybe the basic findings without giving you too many details. Now the next part, there's actually been a change in the natural sciences anyway. The next part used to be traditionally, here's your materials and methods, right? This is, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of what I did. The reagents that I used, if I had reagents, where I got them, where you're documenting it. The purpose of the materials and methods is, for a scientific paper, is that anyone should be able to reproduce your experiments. Right? And I can tell you, I just came back from what's called the studies section for the National Institutes of Health. I was in New Orleans last week. There's a new requirement for funding that you have to have a high degree of confidence that any scientific study is reproducible, and that you are transparent in how you did something. Okay? So that's that part of the paper. It's kind of the most boring part. It's sort of formulaic, but it's critical. Now what's changed recently is that used to be the second part of the paper after the introduction. Now what's happening, because it's not very readable, right? You get all excited, you gotta write a great introduction, right? And then you slog through these material methods, which I'll tell you I never do, because I want to get right to the meat, right? So people finally realize that, editors realize that. So what they do now in many journals is you go from the introduction right to the results, and sometimes the results in the discussion section are combined. That means you've now written a story. It's taken scientists like biologists, physicists, and chemists about 100 years to realize that really what they are doing is telling a story. They are telling a story. They are no different than any other scholar, okay? So I think the best papers these days goes from introduction and right into your results, and sometimes the results in the discussion section are there. Your results are just that. You're reporting what you found. You're not going to expand on it. You're not going to talk about the relevance yet. Okay, that's left for the last section. That's the discussion section. All right? So your discussion is going to talk about, it's going to probably reiterate what the question was, and then it's going to talk about your basic findings, and then most importantly, what are the implications of those findings? And then often after that, it's what's next. Okay, for many scientists, sorry to be crude language, that's called peeing on our ground, marking our territory, right? Because we want to continue the study. But those are important points. This is what we found. This is what it means. This is what's next. And there's one thing we know about knowledge, right? Is that very, very rarely is there a dead end, right? You've all heard it. Every question answered often generates 10 more questions, right? And so that you sort of acknowledge that in your discussion. After those sections of the paper, then it's fairly standard. References. Some natural scientists tend to use in-text, right, citations, and then followed by references. Scientists don't use MLA. They have their own standards, and so there are a couple of scientific standards that you can use. They may differ a little bit between the life sciences and the physical sciences, but it's fairly standard. Okay, so those are easy to find. The other part, of course, is how you present your data in the paper. And this is something I would be really careful about. For a journal like Audeamus, I would give a lot more credence to someone who's going to present their data graphically, or it's more of a pictorial format, than in tabular form, right? Most people who are not in the sciences, I think, find it easier to understand, you know, if they do a good job explaining it in the paper, sort of graphical displays of the presentations of the data versus just throwing a bunch of numbers, which means nothing to most people. Okay, so look for those things. But the most important thing is the clarity of the writing. There is no excuse for anybody not to be able to very clearly articulate what they're trying to say, right? And it's very easy to figure out if they're trying to impress you. You know, you don't want to be impressed. You know, you don't, oh, they use lots of acronyms, or, you know, don't be. You know, if you don't understand what they're saying, you know, what you would do if you were in the room with them is you say, well, I don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? You don't have that option reading a paper, right? It's submitted for review. So when I review a paper, if I have questions, what do I do? You won't have this option, but when I review a paper, if I have questions, what do?
You go back to the author and ask them.
I ask the questions. I say, I'm not accepting this paper yet until you answer these questions, right? Or sometimes I'll say, I'm rejecting the paper because maybe it's not good science in my opinion, or it's just so poorly written. You don't have that option because you don't have a resubmission. So use that as your standard, right? If they're not addressing the question so that you understand it, then I would say, if you're not understanding it, chances are most people aren't going to understand it unless they're in that very narrow field. And that's not what Audeamus is about, right? Okay. So, what else you want to know?
What's a good way to market to people that do mostly science? 'Cause
Yeah.
that's something that we really struggle with.
That is, you know, I think there's a couple of things that Audeamus has to really think about. One is, does it need to be a journal for all fields? You know, there's no definite answer there. There are specialized journals for different areas. So you all know there are literary journals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of an honors literary journal?
Honors literary? Well, there's a
What's that?
Eureka.
Mosaic.
Mosaic is one.
Yeah.
Eureka is one. Scribendi is kind of one, right? They don't accept scientific papers. But similarly, there are specialized journals which focus just on science. And so I think it's kind of neat that you're trying to cover sorts of all things. But again, I think the standard here has to be someone in science is telling a story. It's got to be fundamentally interesting and it's got to be well written. Now, to go after people, I think you have to sort of say that. It's a tough crowd because they do have other options and they may be more comfortable submitting to, you know, a more traditional science journal. I think did you have any last year get published? I can't remember. Any science papers?
Was the one about words, was that a science? That was social science?
I mean,
Not
I don't
really.
consider that a science. I think we kind of put it, I mean, we said it was like roughly like a research paper, but it is more like towards that like essay, literary, like analysis kind of format.
But not anything, I think we had a few, but I don't think that they
In
ended
the
up
past, we did
going.
like a couple
We
of
passed the
chemistry
biochem
papers.
one?
I don't think we did pass the biochem one.
Like
From
for
the-
last year?
Yeah,
I don't think
it got past reading day.
Yes.
Last week, Dr. Sweeney, we were talking about the same thing,
Mhm.
and she was suggesting maybe instead of doing actual research papers, doing more of like the essay kind of article format.
Mhm.
Do you think that would help?
So in natural sciences and psychology has the same thing. We have research papers, and then we have reviews. And so reviews, you know, it's interesting because, you know, after a field's been around for a long time and there's lots of papers, reviews are really good because they summarize the field. They're not considered to be primary literature, right? Because you're taking other people's work. But they tend to be cited more often than primary literature because, you know, it's easier to cite one review article than 100 papers, right? I wouldn't say a review article by itself should be published in Audeamus, but if there's some original thought.
Well, what
that
if it's
results-
like, kind of like a review of their own research, like instead of doing their own, doing their research in form of research paper,
Mhm.
creating like essentially a review of their own work to say like, which gives them practice in being able to convey work in
Sure.
different ways that, do you think that would appeal to science students though, that would?
Yeah, that's a really, for an undergraduate, that's a fairly mature, young scientist already. That implies they've already done an awful lot of work. And there are some out there, but it's gonna be rare. I think.
Since we take video submissions now, what I try to tell the engineers to do is I try to tell them they should bring video of their senior design project where they talk about it instead of some of those drier papers, because I did notice that we don't publish drier papers even when they're good science. So what do you think about that for?
Yeah, there's a journal, I can't quite remember what the acronym stands for, but it's JOVE, it's the Journal of Visual something. It's a scientific journal that is all done in video format. So yeah, I think you could do that.
Journal of Visualized Experiments.
Thank you.
Also, I looked up our journal last year, and we had 3 research pieces. All 3 of them were like a social science. We had one on linguistics, one on Plato's Symposium, and one on women and oppression. So I know we read sciencey ones, but I just don't think they made it past reading day.
Okay.
So I think that's interesting too, to kind of tell them to construct their papers a little differently, in the sense that I think they have a lot of jargon sometimes.
Right.
So.
I mean, I think you should be explicit about certain things, minimize jargon, and when they use it, certainly acronyms need to be defined. I mean, that's standard practice anyway. If you're using a bunch of abbreviations or acronyms, using on the cover page of the paper that you submit, you define what those are. But I think, you might want to have specialized instructions for people in the natural sciences and maybe even engineering, and, just make it clear that, they're telling a story, that they want to minimize jargon. You might want to suggest a particular format that maybe puts the materials and methods. So here's what I would suggest, actually. You want to say paper, because scientific papers tend to be rather large sometimes, when you take in all the words and the data and the figures and the references. What a lot of journals now do is they'll put the materials and methods
Online.
online. So that, it's even nicer, because then the story's kind of a complete story, and then if you're interested, you can go somewhere else and look at the materials and methods. That might be more manageable from a production standpoint for you. Yep.
What about like an article-based format, right? Instead of like a review, like we have something of an article-like nature, and then we actually do a hard link to the actual full-fledged, if not APA-style paper that
Yeah.
you typically see for sciences.
So yeah, what you're talking about is, I think, so that, I don't know how many of you know about the journals Nature and Science?
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you know what makes those journals special? Those articles they're special?
Their word count is like really low.
Ridiculously low,
Yeah.
right? So they're either 1,000 or 1,500 words, and then there's the rare 3 or 4 pager. But
Mhm.
and they have world-class editors who will take a paper and they'll just strip every useless word out of there and still make it read beautifully. I've had that experience with science. It's amazing how they can do it. And then they play other tricks where they put things in supplemental information.
Mhm.
So you could do that. You could, I'm not sure you've got time this year, because your submission deadline is, 3 days?
20, yeah.
But, it's something to consider in the future is, submit sort of a science or nature format where it's short,
Mhm.
and then maybe the full-blown paper
Yeah.
is online somewhere.
Right.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, we could explore that, especially next year as a submission possibility.
But like if we were to run with that idea, would we be the ones editing the paper so that it fits within the?
No, I think
Yeah.
you tell them, you maybe give them an example, or, you say, there's a word limit. You might say, here's your word limit, here's the format. If you look at something like Science and Nature for an idea, And then you can submit, the full, what I would say, if this is accepted, okay, you'll have the option of, putting this online, but this will be what's printed.
I was doing a little digging, and the last science one that I think we did was in edition 7, I
Wow,
think, possibly.
4 years ago.
Nope, it's edition 8. Okay, edition 8, only 3 years ago. It was chronic traumatic encephalopathy in the NBA, or National Football League. Sorry, not the NBA.
Mhm.
And what I remember, because I was one of the people who read this when I first joined, is that I think it passed because it repeated over and over again. So if you didn't get it the first time, you'd get it like the third or fourth time.
I don't know if that's a good thing though.
It seems like it wouldn't be, but with science, if it's sometimes something dense like that,
Mhm.
I think that's maybe why it was a good thing in this case, when normally I wouldn't be very encouraging about that. So that's just a thought.
Do you have any idea, how many submissions do you have?
Right now we have 70. I'm hoping that it'll double by.
By
2020, yeah.
Any science submissions that you've seen?
Of the scientific, I was just looking, of the social science and scientific papers, it seems like there's about roughly 10 and 2 of them are sciencey based. The rest of them are mostly social science. And they're not they don't look like chemistry, they look like, one of them I think is on trees. So might be a little bit, because we were talking to someone, I know that we were talking to somebody at NCHC and he had organic chemistry presentation
Mhm.
that he's worked on forever, and it was a lot of grids with molecules and
Mhm.
crazy stuff. And we were like, hey, we have this journal, and he's like, yeah, I don't think anyone will understand this. So it was kind of hard to market to that, because he's probably not wrong.
What we have been talking about is to take up the ideas that are interesting and just sum them together and make it the actual part of the journal that appears, rather than the full-fledged APA style craziness that you're trying to read and comprehend. I think I'd like to work on that, because that's a nice way of getting to read scientific papers rather than getting lost between sciencey jargon. So
That would help with the flow.
yeah, and the flow of it too, because I feel like the sciences often get pushed aside, but rather not represented enough because of the in-depthness of the work.
Well, it's kind of weird going from poetry or
Yeah.
to short story to hitting this hardcore science.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when
What's happening?
right now 54% of our submissions are poetry.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I'm more article based, more of why should this appeal to the average person?
Even when I was presenting to bio classes, they were like, how would it work? Because we have 30-page papers that we need to go out there, but will people want to read it? So.
Part of what I'm kind of wondering about, and this is just kind of this is a little thought, how much do we want to emphasize the need for literally anyone who picks up the journal to understand what's being said without doing a little bit of legwork?
I don't think it necessarily needs to be everybody.
I
but
think everyone needs to. That's I don't know. To me, that's a non-compromising point of Audeamus. You can't have someone pick up the book and be like, let's go with that example of trees, I don't know, molecular sciences of trees, and not be able to understand it, because it's an important part, like we've been just talking, right? It's a culmination of everything you're trying to encompass in the educational system.
But be a little bit careful here. So I've got to defend my science colleagues a little bit, because if you're going to exact that standard, then you better be able to say with high confidence that any science student who picks it up is going to feel comfortable reading poetry.
And the
Poetry.
social science papers and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're expecting the lowest common denominator to understand everything. I don't think you need to. I think some people are going to be, I know, I'm not going to understand most of it. You don't need to call me the lowest common denominator. But I mean, like, yeah, there's gonna be poetry people aren't gonna understand. There's gonna be science people understand. That's fine. I think you just want to capture at least a decent sized net.
Right.
There might even be poetry that you don't even like. There's plenty that I don't like.
Right.
But like, I don't think you're necessarily. I think the idea is the whole journal has something that everybody can like.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and
But-
also encourages undergraduate work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, some people like. I like reading about science. I probably won't understand most of these papers that are gonna come through. But if you put it in an article format, like, I probably will understand it better, and I will be interested, and I will read it. That may not be everybody else who reads it, though.
Mhm.
That's okay.
I think that when we talk about like understandability of science, I think it has to be like interesting enough to be like, oh, I wonder what this actually means. Like, what does this actually mean? Rather than like focusing on like, oh, the data and the results section has to be like completely understandable to anyone who like just picks it up randomly. I think, like, even when I read things that's like I don't really know what's going on, but I skip to the discussion and like I read like important parts and be like, I kind of get what's going on.
Right.
So that's like more important than
Mhm.
like having all of it be understandable.
I don't think we want to sacrifice the interdisciplinarity of this journal because it's what makes the journal special.
Mhm.
If we just start publishing like literature and articles the way some people have been proposing, we're going to be heavily competing with things like Mosaic and Scribendi, and we're going to be heavily competing with those as well as other like specialized journals. Whereas this way, when it has everything, we're going to get audiences from everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because since this is a part of honors and honors is an interdisciplinary kind of thing, I just
Showcase. Yeah.
think that we should be maybe a little more open-minded of some of the pieces we've gotten
Yeah.
in terms of the sciences.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that's something we could think about too, like you said, is changing the submission, because clearly we have an issue if 2 of the 13 submissions are science and the rest are social science in the 15 category, like, if 2 of them, that's not, there's clearly not as much of a drive to publish those, or try to get them
I mean,
published.
marketing wise, I mean, I think going forward, you know, when you come up with a theme, and when you talk about who do you get to submit in the natural sciences, then you've got to, I think, market that, you know, here's the thing, what's your theme this year?
Spectacle.
Spectacle. So that's an interesting theme, right? You know, so I started thinking, what kind of scientists might, you know, publish on the theme of spectacle? You know, my bias is, boy, I'd love to get an astronomy paper.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, right, maybe some deep space imaging, right, or, you know, something like that. Or maybe I might wanna have something that documents climate change and, you know, over time, or their particular impact, and, you know, I mean, you can come up with that, but it's whatever's gonna sort of jostle somebody, say, oh, I can make that fit, rather than just have, you know, all comers submit and then you're forcing it. That's a lot more work on your part. But, you know, you might be, as you come up with a theme next year, you know, you might give examples of fields that might fit that particular thing. They might need a little more help, right?
What if we ask the science students what they would look for that would make them interested in submitting?
That's a good
What if we
idea.
come up with like a little survey or
Advance
something?
notice. Advance notice.
It'd be like,
Well, I mean, our-
what
2
interests you?
years.
What
Like-
would get you to want to submit to this?
Right. As far as advance notice goes, this is the 11th year that Audeamus has been a thing, and our submission window has been open since I think July.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a lot of advance notice. People just put it off till
Well,
the deadline.
are we marketing enough in spring?
Well, and that's something we can talk about too, is changing our marketing approaches. This is the first year that we've gone nationwide, so we have been sending out tons of emails. Over the summer, our marketing approach was altered slightly just due to budget and cash prices and whatnot. But I mean, this is definitely kind of an experimental year. So this is something we could talk about doing once we get this journal out, like changing submission deadlines and changing submission guidelines, and if that's something we want to pursue, I think that this would be a fantastic time to do it. Because now that we've experienced this first year of going nationwide, we can find what works and what doesn't work. So I think the science guidelines could be something we could definitely talk about.
Anyway, I mean, as these come in, if you want to bounce things off me in the past, even things like Faulkner versus, I can't remember who the other author was. I had fun with that.
Marquez.
What was that?
Marquez.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. I had fun with that. So, I mean, I don't know, how many of you are taking honors 2A right now? Look at they sheepishly hold it there.
You're like, I got an
Right.
SAD tomorrow.
Oh, yeah, it's done though, right? It's done. So, I mean, so you've seen, so what I'm trying to model in the class, whether you understand it or not, is, the first 3 presentations I've given, and next tomorrow is another one, are things I've never spoken about before, right? And that's because, I like to learn. And then I like to learn, and then I like to process what I've learned, and I like to find a way to communicate it to an interdisciplinary audience. I think that's what anybody should be doing in Audeamus,
Yeah.
right? Poetry is always a tough one, and I love poetry, but I love poetry for a couple of reasons. A, it tortures me because it engages my mind, but at the same time, as I start to process what I'm reading. And, again, I sort of really like classics, so I have this tendency to try and always read poetry in meter, which doesn't always work, as I find out. But then it touches my heart and my soul, right? And so there's this kind of, really weird mix that I really enjoy. I love the challenge of poetry. And I don't try, at least personally, I don't try and say, what's the poet trying to say? I don't deconstruct poems, but it almost always means something to me, and that's why I like it. But it took me a long time to get there, a long time to get there, and that's fine. But I think the same thing should be true of a science paper. Don't be afraid of the challenge. It has to be clear, right? I'd love it someday if somebody wrote a science paper and it says poetry. But at least they should be writing it. What I would say is it should be prose. In fact, that's the story, right? No epic poems, but it should be something like that. Okay. All right, I've got a dress rehearsal. Concert Sunday downtown.
Where is it at?
It's at the Calvary Presbyterian Church at 3 o'clock.
Oh, yes. You mentioned something about it during the retreat, too.
Did I?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's because I had
Yeah.
That was another concert. That was the gun violence concert.
Oh.
That was a different concert that's coming up.
Well, thank you for.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good luck.